Hare Krishna. Today I'm going to talk about something which has really kept me intrigued for a very, very long time, and that is the soul or psychic being's role in supramental yoga. As you already know, that I follow uh, the teachings of the mother and SriAurobindo, and I practice based on their teachings. I've been practicing for a very long time, but there has been so much of focus on the psychic being, the soul, in supramental yoga that I always have tried to understand very clearly what exactly is psychic being or soul, why it is so important, why Mother and Sri Aurobindo has put such tremendous focus on this. Because as you know that when we talk about Jnana Yoga or Yoga of self-realization, whether you talk about Buddhism or Jainism or you talk about Advaita Vedanta, all of them talk about self. Like one must try to be united with the self. When the mind gets united with the self after long practice, ego is completely destroyed and the non dual reality is realized. So one becomes non dual and realizes the non duality. So there is no concept of soul there. There is nothing like an individual soul. On realization of the non dual self, one realizes that one is everything. And that same reality abides as everything. So there is really no distinction between I and the rest. So there is no God, there is no world, there is no I, there is nothing. It is just one reality. And and in Hinduism, we have so much of different terms being used: Atman, Brahman, Self. And here comes integral yoga, where Sri Aurobindo put so much of focus on identifying the psychic being, uniting with the psychic being, and making sure the psychic being is the one that leads you to the realization of God. Because ultimately, in Sri Aurobindo's Supramental Yoga, the focus is on evolution of the soul or evolution of the psychic being. Uh, Self realization is only one aspect of it. Uh, so, in some places, he says the self realization is the starting point of this yoga, but ultimate objective is evolution of the soul or evolution of the individual consciousness. And when I try to read a lot of literatures on it and I practice it, and Mother says that not even one in a million has even glimpse of the soul or the psychic being. The only place in our traditional literature where we hear something about the soul is Kathopanishad, where Yama is talking about the fire in the heart, in the cave of the heart. And that fire, he says, it is in the size of a man's thumb, and that is our immortal essence. And by realizing that or becoming united with that fire, one realizes one's immortality. There are many Sufi teachers who have spoken about the soul and evolution of the soul, the journey of the soul. There is one teacher who is a self-realized master who currently lives in California. He is British by birth, but he lives in California. He has spoken about the soul's journey. And in one time he said he saw the souls of little kids as almost like there is light inside their heart when they were walking on the street. He saw it for a very brief period of time. Then I found one person who I know very closely. had the experience of the soul. And it's exactly the classic description of the soul as it is described in Kathopanishad. Then there is another person who has asked SriAurobindo. He said that one day during meditation he saw a flame in the shape of a thumb uh, in his heart. And he said, "What is it that I experienced?" And SriAurobindo says, "It is your soul or it is the psychic flame." He has used different words interchangeably for the soul. So what is actually the difference between the soul, the Atman, or Brahman? Atman and Brahman are used interchangeably. It's the same thing as the self. But what is the difference between the soul and the self? And why soul is so important to Sufis, or it is so important to devotees, people who follow the path of devotion, and why it is extremely important in supramental yoga. I'm trying to explain this in this video because I struggled myself for many years trying to understand it myself, and finally when I understood it, I realized why it is so critical. And then I came to know it also from somebody who had the realization by the grace of Divine Mother. Then I said, this is definitely that's something I must share, because there must be others struggling with the same thing. And it is said that the soul initially starts as a flame. It's a flame or a spark of the divine. It's the divine. It is the immortal essence of the divine. As a spark, it dwells in the heart of a being. And as it progresses with many incarnations, with practice of yoga, with devotion, with all kinds of spiritual practices and devotional practices, it slowly grows and it becomes a flame. And that flame dwells in the cave of the heart. That is immortal. In the mortal frame, in our physical body, in this mortal body, that flame is the immortal essence. And that immortal essence is our own soul. And a person with long practice, by focusing his concentration in his heart, by devotion, by worshipping divine in his heart, by meditating on heart, by silencing his mind and focusing all his concentration in his heart, by the grace of God, comes in contact with that flame. And the first thing that happens is the vision of the flame, and then ultimately one experiences this flame and becomes identified with the flame. And that particular flame is actually doorway to Brahman or God. So once one has identified with the flame, one has realized that one is the flame, the consciousness gets united with the flame, the spiritual path becomes very safe. So journey becomes safe. So that particular essence is always connected with the divine. So the soul, which is individual, every person has a soul, and that soul or that flame is unique. Its journey is unique. Its realizations are unique. It has its own evolutionary journey. And there is a very beautiful way that the Sufi teacher was explaining about it. He said that when he himself realized the self of Brahman, he said his ego was shattered completely. And then he could not distinguish between him and anything else. So he was almost helpless for 6 months. His mother was feeding him, and the same experience also Raman Maharshi had described. At that time, there is no distinction, there is no space, there is no time, there is no distinction, there is no I, there is no other. And because of that, he had such a big struggle, and took almost 6 months for for his ego to be reconstituted, because without ego one cannot function in the world. But the beauty of taking the path of the soul is, because the soul is individual, when one gets united, the consciousness gets united with the soul, the ego drops off, but the person continues to remain an individual. And his journey, as the Sufi master says, is a progressive unification or absorption in divine. So the growth is more and more divinization of the individuality. His mind becomes more and more divine. Emotions become more divine. His physical body starts turning divine. So the divine consciousness getting absorbed into the individual consciousness or the individual is progressive. That is why the person never loses the touch with the world, unlike the one who has directly got enlightenment or become absorbed in the self. Those people find it very hard to function in the world, because when they come back to the ordinary consciousness, it is completely different. And when they are in the unity consciousness, it's completely different. So many of them sometimes drop their body, or many of them become reclusive, and they tend to spend more time in samadhi. So the soul is our own immortal essence, which is always connected with the divine. And when one takes the path of the soul, the journey becomes progressive. It's progressive absorption, the divine. One comes in contact with the subtle worlds. One comes in contact with the hierarchy of consciousness that exists. One moves from one level of consciousness to the next, to the next, to the next. Ultimately, when one becomes united with the Brahman consciousness, or the consciousness of the self, or the cosmic consciousness. But that happens progressively. And because it happens progressively, the evolution of consciousness, one is able to function in the world and slowly progresses to divine realization without losing the world. Otherwise, one has to retire from the world, withdraw from the world, and he either lives in the world or he lives in the self. It becomes very hard for him to integrate both. Because SriAurobindo's yoga is evolutionary in nature, it says that by first identifying the flame in the heart, cave of your heart, through practice of meditation, to prayer, to devotion, to surrender to the divine and divine mother, one, first of all, this flame reveals itself, and then one becomes united with it, and then his ego automatically drops off, but without losing the individuality. He becomes the soul, he becomes the psychic personality. His consciousness becomes interiorized, and then it starts getting more and more absorbed in divine consciousness without losing the world. He continues to operate in the world, discharges his responsibility, just like Kabir. Kabir had taken the path of the soul. And he talks about a journey to divine, his absorption in the divine, but without losing the world. He was still doing his work. He used to create his clothes, he used to sell, he used to compose music. He was living in the world with his family. And there has been many such saints. Raidas was one of them. And those great devotees, they had taken the path of the soul. And this is something that I wanted to clarify. I hope it has become clear to everybody. And because I'm no teacher, I'm just a student. And since I struggled it for many years trying to understand the concept, until I got it, I just wanted to make sure that I share this with all my friends who are trying to understand what is soul and why it is important and how it is different from the self or cosmic consciousness or Brahman. Soul is individual and Brahman is cosmic. It's the unity consciousness. In Brahman consciousness or cosmic consciousness, there is no time, there is no space, there is no individual, only that exists. And in soul consciousness, one realizes owns one immortal essence, one realizes that one is immortal, but without losing his individuality. One realizes that he is individual, he is immortal, he or she is immortal, and is a person of the divine or a child of the divine, a devotee of the Lord, and he progressively approaches the divine and progressively gets absorbed in the divine consciousness without losing the world, without getting disoriented. And that's the beauty. I hope I clarified it, and thanks for listening to this. Hare Krishna. Thank you.